Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
On Mount Everest in 1996, and if you've read Jon Krakauer's brilliant book Into Thin Air, you'll know all about this. That year on Everest, 8 climbers died in one 24-hour period, and a total of 15 died during that summer's climbing season. And by 1996, I mean, this was obviously very tragic, but what was especially curious about it was that by 1996, Everest was a known quantity. You know, if you had the money, as today, you can pay professional climbers to train you and take you to the top. What happened essentially was that there was a traffic jam a couple of hundred feet below the summit, and the smooth progression of the climbers was interrupted by a sort of bottleneck. And instead of following protocol and abandoning their attempt to get to the top, many of these very experienced climbers just kept pushing on to the summit, which meant that they got there far too late in the day, which meant that many of them had to descend in darkness and bad weather at night, and that was when they came to grief. But what I discovered was that there was someone else in the area that day who was really the last person in the world who you think would have anything to contribute to explaining something like this. He was a burned-out stockbroker from Indiana called Christopher Case, and he was on a hiking holiday in the foothills of the Himalayas. He'd got sick of his job, and he'd quit it, and he'd come there to recharge his batteries. He didn't plan to get involved in anything so horrifying. But the more he heard about the tragedy, he told me, the more and more it gnawed at him, and he ended up dedicating years of his life afterwards to studying it. He told me that it haunted him as if it had happened to a member of his own family. And the thing that haunted him was that it reminded him of something he'd seen happen over and over again in the world that he had become so sick of, the business world, where a chief executive would choose some very ambitious goal, commit to it very publicly, get all their underlings to commit to it publicly, and really start fighting for it. And then evidence would start to creep in that it was actually in some way an unwise goal, that it was a bad idea. And people would start to feel anxious and uncertain and insecure and worried. And they'd have a real problem with having those negative feelings, and so in order to get rid of them, they would commit to the goal even harder than they had before. They would push on, and sometimes come to grief. So Chris Case is now an expert in organizational sociology and psychology, and believe me, he really does know how annoying it is for mountaineers to hear that sort of, well, here's a lesson from the world of business that can help you climb mountains. But the really interesting thing is that there is actually some strong psychological evidence that this does happen, this same dynamic with mountaineers. Chris found an old study from 1963 in which a group of psychologists had accompanied an American climbing party who were attempting to scale Everest, and had them keep very, very detailed diaries throughout the whole endeavor. Some of these climbers wanted to try an alternative, dangerous approach route up the mountain that had never been achieved before. And when their diaries were analyzed afterwards, this group, they found exactly the same pattern was identified. They would encounter information about that made their preferred route look problematic, something to do with weather patterns, problems with their equipment, whatever it might be. And that would make them feel uncertain and anxious, and they expressed those emotions in the journals that they were keeping. And then to erase the uncertainty and the anxiety, they would commit even harder to the goal that they had set themselves. And what Chris Case' subsequent research suggests is that they had made the goal into a part of their identities. It wasn't just some external project that wasn't working out. It was a part of them, and they couldn't tolerate having uncertainty and anxiety be a part of that. And so to stamp it out, they took the problematic incoming information and turned it into a reason to push even harder. But I guess what I want to suggest is that this is a sort of overarching principle for something that we get really wrong about happiness, success, whatever goals we set ourselves, which is that we're so allergic to the experience of negative emotions that we focus all our energies on stamping them out, focusing on positivity and optimism and things working out instead, and that often as a result, we end up bringing about exactly the eventuality that we didn't want. So what I've been exploring over the last few years is this opposite approach, really, which is what I'm calling in the book the negative path to happiness and success, which involves sort of turning towards uncertainty, embracing the experience of failure, even pessimism, and just more generally that the power of negative thinking. But it's true, there is now a large body of evidence that suggests that many of those sort of older generation of positive thinking tricks fall victim to exactly the problem that I'm talking about. That when you focus on eliminating negativity, you end up bringing about the result you're trying to avoid. But I think what really became clear to me doing all this reporting was that it isn't just those crazy, grinning, positive thinking gurus who have the problem, and that really all of us, to some extent, are victims of what one philosopher I came across calls the cult of optimism. You know, we think that happiness is the same thing as positivity, and that optimism is always preferable to pessimism, and it gets us into trouble as a result. I think it's really well summed up in a quote that is often attributed to Edith Wharton, which is, if only we'd stop trying so hard to be happy, we could have a pretty good time. Turns out that the original Stoics of ancient Greece and Rome had a much more accommodating and open approach towards negative experiences and emotions. One of their favorite techniques, which I love, was called the premeditation of evils. And the idea was that instead of focusing on the best case scenario, you should focus on the worst case scenario. If you focus on reassurance, on trying to convince yourself or someone else that it's all going to work out fine, you sort of subtly and at the same time reinforce this unspoken flip side, which is that it would be really terrible if they didn't work out fine. And so the Stoics say, do the opposite. Imagine the worst. You know, I think if we are in a situation ever where we fear losing a job, losing a relationship, something like that, you flash forward immediately to absolute catastrophe, to being completely destitute, to being completely miserable for the rest of your days. But what Albert Ellis used to like to say, he's very influenced by the Stoics, he used to say that the worst thing about any future happening is usually your exaggerated belief in its horror. So if you practice the premeditation of evils, you give it some limits. It might still be really bad, but it's not this kind of bottomless, infinite badness. The Buddhists have another take on this negative path to happiness. Meditation, obviously, as you'll know, is all the rage these days in sort of well-being circles. And so in the interest of journalism, I went on a week-long silent meditation retreat in a remote part of Massachusetts, where I had to get up at 5:30 in the morning and try to follow my breath for 10 hours a day. But what you gradually figure out, if you force yourself to go and do that for a week, is that this practice of meditation is not about trying to make your mind calm and tranquil, because that actually is a kind of positive thinking. And it's actually somewhat more about what the Buddhists call non-attachment. An analogy they use for thoughts and emotions is, modern-day Buddhist writers and teachers, is of weather. You know, the idea that rather than trying to force away the bad stuff, you're just learning to let whatever come and arise and pass away. And then finally, I want to mention a third example of negative thinking, which is this long-lost tradition of memento mori. You know, the idea of building in constant reminders of mortality into everyday life, in those times of life when we would have no reason otherwise to remember that that's where it's all headed. There is now really, really strong psychological evidence from research that even very subliminal reminders of death can have these salutary effects. There was a study where they interviewed some people who, as they walked through a cemetery, and some people who were walking a few blocks away. And for some of these people, they spoke to them about the importance of helping. They asked them questions about the importance of helping other people to make this issue salient in their minds. And then, as the interview was over, one of the researchers dropped her files and notebook on the ground. And the people in the cemetery, who we can assume had a little trigger to think about mortality, were 40% more likely to help out by picking up the researchers' notebooks. So this is a few tastes of what I found as I started exploring this path. There's much more in the book. I think the thing that I really want to emphasize about it is that all these ways of responding to or maybe overcoming our allergy towards negativity are not they're not all just sort of high-minded ways of reaching some kind of spiritual a higher plane of realization. They are really, really practical. And if you look, for example, at some very practical research that's been done into the habits of entrepreneurs, this is business school studies where they've taken people who've already got a track record of, commercial success. You find, they do use the premeditation of evils. They don't usually call it that, which is actually a great way of trying to approach any big life decision, I think. You don't try and persuade yourself that this plan is going to work out. You try to work out exactly how bad it would be if it didn't. And then if the answer is that that would be a tolerable loss, then that's your answer. You take the action. They make little forays into the future, not really knowing where they're going. They learn to live with the feeling of total uncertainty. They endlessly change what it is they think they're developing or where it is they think they're going. And they treat it in this way of thinking that has been called effectuation by one of these scholars. It's like you come home and you want to make dinner, so you look in the fridge and the cupboards to see what's there. The equivalent would be you look at what skills, resources, ideas you have, and you see what you can make with them, rather than deciding on the thing you're going to make and trying to force reality over a period of years to conform to your views. And even these Buddhist ideas about non-attachment turn out to be a really great way of just overcoming procrastination, I find. Because if you tell yourself that you've got to feel motivated before you can do something, which sometimes you might be able to do, but other times is going to slow you down and add another stage you've got to get through before you can do things. And if you can just say, well, I don't feel like doing this, there is this weather going on, but also at the same time I'm going to do it. You can go ahead and act without having to first of all get the emotions right. Back in 1951, Alan Watts, the sort of 1960s popular philosopher who was a kind of motivating force behind quite a lot of this book, wrote a very thin little treatise called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And in that book, he starts from this premise that the world feels more insecure than it ever has done. And if that was true in 1951, then it's surely even more true today. And he makes this very powerful argument for what he calls the backwards law, that a big part of why we feel so much insecurity is our endless quest for a feeling of security. That the relationships we rely on for happiness can only really flower if we let ourselves be vulnerable to a certain degree. And that in a world where everything might not turn out for the best, going forward with a sort of insistence that everything must turn out for the best is just a bad tool for that job. So I just want to finish up with a story that I encountered during my reporting that comes from the Zen tradition. Like all those stories, though, it is about an eager young monk and a wise old monk. And the eager young monk asks the wise old monk a question in these teaching stories. And in this case, he says, "Oh, wise teacher, how can I find the monk who is the most enlightened in all the land, who's really cracked the code of human existence?" And the older monk ponders the question for a while, and then presently he says, "You need to find the man who claims to have eliminated every trace of negativity from his mind. And when you find that person, you'll know it's not him." So that's what I have to say. I hope it makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Isn't it actually good to be dissatisfied? There's lots of evidence that anxiety keeps us vigilant and keeps us alive, that dissatisfaction makes us build better things in our society. Isn't happiness not really all in the mind? Isn't it about our quality of life? And isn't it good to be dissatisfied and to build and do more?
I guess it's not quite the same as what I was saying, is it? Because I think most of what I'm trying to do here, and it's, I'm very open here and hopefully here as well about being, fundamentally a reporter. So my job as I saw it was to go and find out what people had to say. And then yes, I think it's true. There's lots of good stuff that comes from people being dissatisfied. Most obviously, political change and sort of social justice. But the bit that is trickiest for me, I think, I didn't talk about it in the talk, but in the book, the stuff about death and mortality. Ernest Becker, who I write about a bit, who wrote the book The Denial of Death, talks about denying death being the sort of fundamental motivating force of huge amounts of human civilization. Yeah, it leads to this slightly problematic conclusion that if we all overcame that denial, which he thought one should broadly by the end of his life, we might stop. We'd stop fighting wars, which would be great, but then we'd also stop making great art and literature as a way of trying to become immortal.